going to get plenty more people filing in for this one, because we've got a fantastic 45 minutes to find out all about true stories and how these fine folk next to me deal with them. It's a bit of a genre mix, so we're going to mainly be talking about scripted and how people deal with true stories when we're talking about dramas and scripted, but we're going to probably skip into a little bit of documentary and factual as well. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to run through who is sat up at the front. As I say, fantastic panellists. We're very lucky to have them all. First, to my left, I'm sure a few of you have seen Frank already up here today. Frank Spotnitz, CEO of Big Light Productions. Next to Frank, we've got Michael Iskas, CEO at Antenna Studios. Next to Michael, we've got Larry Bass, CEO at Shinawil out of Ireland. Second from the end, we've got Rita Grebanjinkova, Head of Film Production and Producer at Ukrainian Producers Hub. And Dariusz Jablonski, Founder, CEO, Producer, Director at Apple Film Production. So, we've got through all of that. Let's quickly run down the line and hear about some of the true stories and the series that you guys have been doing. Frank, we'll start with yourself. Talk to us about some of the shows that you've got on the slate at the moment that touch on the true story.
I just have to tell you quickly, I just remembered when we were talking in the green room that when the X-Files first started, the first episode said based on true events. And season 3, this fan comes up to me, and by this point we'd had liver-eating monsters that came out of your toilet. Like, when are you going to run out of true stories? I'm sorry, that was episode 1. We ran out of true stories.
That's a good place to start.
But I have done, since coming to Europe, I've done a number of true stories, which is to say, based on real people. So I did 3 seasons of The Medici for Rai and Netflix. I did Leonardo for the Alliance and Amazon. And I now have several projects in development that are based on true stories, including one that's been announced recently based on the Nuremberg trials.
Good stuff. Michael, let's talk to you about Antenna Studios. You guys, you've done some interesting projects with them, and perhaps we might touch on some of the projects previously at your previous job as well, if we can. Tell us about some of the shows you've been on.
I guess there are the stories we've done and the stories we always wanted to make that we haven't done yet. So I think we should also be talking about the stories we want to make in the future. About 3 years ago, we created the story of called X-Ray, which is the ex-king of Spain, X-Ray, Juan Carlos, the life of Juan Carlos, that was developed in my previous production company, which was very difficult to research and to create a story about somebody who's A, alive, B, a public figure, and C, in the middle of lots of stories in the press. So that was the first time when I realized how careful you have to be when you handle topics like this. It started as a Spotify podcast, actually, in Spain. It became the most successful podcast in Spain. And then on the back of this, it was commissioned to become a TV series. And it's in development with Stars Play and Sony, from the producers of Homeland in the US. So I've left that business, but the story continues. I've also done a story called Hunting Ghislaine, which was when the whole Epstein scandal came about. We jumped at the time there's a Ghislaine Maxwell story here. Mm-hmm. So again, it started with lots of research, lots of lawyers, and you always have to lawyer up when you deal with true stories, I think. And that also became a very successful podcast at the beginning with Global Radio in the UK, and life continues for that as well. Now, being in Greece, I have a fiction project that starts with a true event, which was a 1980s event when an epic shopping mall burned down in Athens. So it starts with a true event, but then it continues into how this affected the lives of the people that used to work there. So there's also this, which are like true events that affect people's lives, fictional lives. And lots of other projects I'm not going to bore you about now, but lots to talk about. I'll shut up for now. We continue with our friend here.
Yeah, Larry, tell us about, you moved into scripted a couple of years ago. You've got, I think it's 5 projects on the go at the moment. Some of the shows you've got in development are based on true stories, true crimes. Tell us a little bit about those projects, just to set the scene in terms of what you're doing on this genre.
So I suppose I came into the world of scripted from entertainment television and reality. And reality is the truth, so called. We never change. That actually happens.
That's a whole different session.
But I think there's shows we're now looking. So we're trying to base most of the shows we're working on IP. So books that are actually about real people or are about the real life event. And we're also creating original IP ourselves. So the book we've a book we've optioned at the moment from a English writer who's actually partnered with a police detective inspector who cracked one of the biggest murder mystery events in the UK. They tracked down a serial killer over 6 different English police forces that took over 4 years to nail one of the most notorious criminals in Britain, a Scottish man called Robert Black, who was convicted of murdering 4 children, young children. And what we're working on is developing that story, which it's not the story of Robert Black, but it is the story of how those detectives had to change a system within policing. The system was just so antiquated that they actually were missing some clues because it wasn't a joined up police force. They weren't working with computers back then. Their whole systems were antiquated. And it was about those people, their lives, their families, how having to deal with such horrendous murders and dealing with picking those parents up off the floor, how it affected their lives. So it's a really interesting project. It's dark in lots of ways, but I think it'll play into this fascination. We as human beings seem to have more of an interest in a real life murder than if somebody goes and writes a novel about a murder. I don't know what's inside us as human beings that we want to know more about real life crime. But it is fascinating. We've also got a drama based on the first ever transatlantic flight, which took place in 1919 from Newfoundland to a bog in the west of Ireland. 2 men flew a biplane. I think I spoke to you about this in London a couple of years ago. A biplane held together with canvas and timber. A flight that took over 16 hours. It was like going to the moon in 1919. And the 2 guys that made that flight had never flown before until it took off. Just an extraordinary adventure. And it is based on a real life event. And the people around it and their story. So I think real, true stories are fascinating. But you've got to fit them into a narrative that plays out over, if it's TV, an hour of TV, if it's a film, 90 minutes. And that's when the geniuses, the writers who have to adapt those projects come into play.
Good stuff. And Rita, let's turn to yourself. You're working out in Ukraine, so thank you. Fantastic to have you here. You've got a really interesting project, The Silence, which I think Marika talked about earlier. They picked it up in Belgium through Lumiere. It's done really well. Topic in the States, HBO Max in Eastern Europe. True story again. So this is based on a book, I gather. Yeah. Tell us a bit about that show and kind of how it came about. Some of the challenges that were thrown up as well in producing it.
Thank you for your question and thank you for inviting me. So yes, last year my company, Ukrainian Producers Hub, was lucky to be a co-producer of this great series, Silence. So this show is based on one of the novels of Draga Held, and the novel was so, I would say, so up to date. So as I know, it occurs even some changes in the government. So the true story was really true. And it's about traffic young women from Ukraine to Europe. And today we are shooting season 2 because the first one was so successful and it's still being distributed. Tomorrow I'm living on the set in Osiak, so they're shooting some scenes with the Ukrainian cast. She came from Ukraine as well, Ksenia Mishina. And we are very grateful to our Croatian co-producers, our partners, who in these hard times are so courageous, so they allowed us to stay in, and even just they promised me 2 days in Kyiv somehow in February, and I promise that I'll have a magic to organize it somehow. I hope that things will be better. And when I was invited to this panel and I saw the topic about how far the true story can be true, I was like, oh, this is about me. So I came from the truest place in the world, probably. So Ukraine is so true right now, so we don't want to go there. And the industry is really low. Like it's very. We were trying to stay alive, to do something. So we don't shoot shows right now, but we do a lot of documentaries, and with the help of European producers as well, and from United States. And I have this one documentary in development about refugees, about women who are fleeing from the war, from Kharkiv, saving their kids. And we are looking for the partners in Europe as well. It's his true story. It's real lives, real women, but still the point is subjunctive. Of course, this is a point of view of creators and of talents who are involved in it. So let's discuss.
Yeah, I mean, subjective is the word. That seems to be the one that is probably key here. Darius, briefly tell us about the shows that you've got, and you've been working on documentaries, but also scripted. So what's the approach, perhaps, when you're looking at projects on those two strands? How do you?
My position is that for this part of Europe, post-communistic part of Europe, the truth is absolutely vital thing, because for many years we were lied. Mm-hmm. So this is completely new dimension, and in the 90s I was a producer and director also of documentaries, as you mentioned, and we are making investigative documentaries about crimes of communist regime. So then, the ethic asked for really truth in every detail, because you had to reveal something which is unknown. Maybe that's why, regarding scripted, are more flexible. I think that there is a space of freedom you can use. But I love script writers who, even if they are fictionalizing, the story, they eat bits and bytes of reality. This is the most interesting, I had the pleasure to work with Tony Jordan. Yep. And it was amazing because he was expecting, when we were doing The Passing Bells about First War, a story which we did in co-production with UK, and we were researching facts and elements. Marie Curie-Skłodowska had created X-ray cars, which were making X-rays just at the front. And I remember when we delivered that to Tony, he said, what a great idea. And one of the main heroes was a nurse in these X-ray cars. So real genius in script writing, they are devouring every element of reality. And I really believe that this is also part of the truth. But of course, you have to, because very randomly, life of somebody or real events are scripts already made. Mm. And you have to be inspired, be based, but you have to create your own story. Otherwise, it will not work. Okay. It is not standing alone, I would say.
And really interesting points there. Frank, we were talking in the green room about Leonardo, which is a really interesting example because I guess the assumption is that the longer ago the event, the more leeway you've got to some extent, which probably is a fair assumption to make. But then, I think it was you said, Michael, you've got Leonardo. that you did with the Alliance. And obviously you've got an entire country that's got probably quite a fixed opinion of what Leonardo is. How do you then approach that true story and replicating that true story so that it reflects reality and truth, but also is engaging and entertaining and going to get people to actually watch it?
The word true or truth is such an interesting, slippery word because no two people agree on what it is, right? You can agree on dates and these things did happen and these people really did live, but everything else is subject to interpretation. You have to have a reason why you're telling this supposedly true story. And, you know, look at Shakespeare and his history plays. Like, they're not true, right? They're great works of art. But I would say both with Medici and Leonardo, we made no pretense that this was factual. There's a lot of truthful events and historical characters, but, you know, to me, one of the great movies of all time, great plays of all time is Amadeus. And it's about Salieri killing Mozart, poisoning Mozart, which almost certainly did not happen. And I don't care. I learned more about Mozart and the beauty of classical music from that not true story than from, you know, just about any other factual film I can think of. So I think sometimes you shed light and give insight into real people by inventing things. And actually I think just about any drama that purports to be true inevitably invents things. But having said that, I now know, having done a lot of true stories, that the more you can say to the audience, this really did happen, the more satisfying it is to them. And speaking about your point about the closer you are to the present day, like with the Nuremberg Trials project, I am being really scrupulous about the facts and the real people. And if they are real people who lived, I'm being really, really careful about not inventing things, because I feel, even though that was, 80 years ago, that particular period of history is so fraught and painful and significant even now that you have a responsibility to be as accurate as you possibly can be.
It's an interesting one. I mean, obviously, a lot of documentation that you can go back to, and in a way, I guess IP, like Larry was saying, is really important. You know, it's not IP, but it's IP related. Your show on the murders, we can perhaps talk about that, Larry, and the importance of IP to build the truth or the story on. How do you go about, if you can tell us about the project with the murders and that case, you know, are you speaking to, you've got the original IP, so the book, you've obviously got contacts with the person who wrote it, the detective. Are you then also, do you think it's important to speak to the victims' families, etc.? Where do you draw the line in terms of research?
Well, I think on that particular case, it is a hard case, and Fear the Stranger is the name of the book. Because the book is out, that's the first telling of the story. So it's not always the case that if somebody writes a book about a murder, that it's always going to be made into a film, and the victim's family have to see that story replayed again, you know, for the amusement of the nation or nations. And that's got to be hard. But at least if the book is out there, they've gone through that place.
Makes life easier for the TV producer
Right,
if the
if
book
its
is
book
already
is
out.
existing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And it'll draw out some other angst or other issues or other things that we should be aware of, that we can address. And certainly it certainly is a much easier thing than if it just been possibly a newspaper article that we were trying to adapt, which also happens. I think the research that the guys have done, and the fact that one of the co-writers was one of the investigating officers, and that's, you know, that story is our protagonist will live there, rather than glorifying a murderer, which we're very conscious of.
Yeah.
And I think I was saying to Richard, talking about the session, you know, for me, I'm not a writer. I try and find things I think I can sell, but, you know, through the writers, I assume when you're looking at a project, you take a point of view, and, you know, your version of what that truth will become is based on a point of view. Yep. I gave the example of January 6th in the US. if you're doing a drama based on those events, and you were a supporter of the ex-president, would you take a different view of those events to if you weren't a supporter of that president and you're writing that story? So that's where the true story, all it is the starting point.
And Darius, I mean, yeah, let's carry on that point. The sort of as you were saying, the importance of building on the truth, but also this is entertainment after all. Where do you sort of draw that line? Some of the projects that you've been working on, how far can you push the entertainment value, but how far do you have to maintain the narrative of what we think the truth is?
I think that the word which Frank used, responsibility, is very important, especially being producer and creator as well. You know, I feel sometimes responsibility is much bigger than usually. You know, at the moment I'm preparing shooting of my film, which I co-wrote the script, which is based on real story of Polish immigrant who was tased to death by 4 RCMP guys in Vancouver airport. And the more I researched, the more details I get to know, I realize how important it is to tell every detail, because it played a main role, you know, all the details. They murdered him, but they were innocent, you know, because there were many inquiries, and with every inquiry they were left innocent, sentenced by the court. So every detail plays main role, and detail can change the meaning. But sometimes I think that, you know, you shouldn't go detail by detail. You have to be credible by finding the essence of the story. Sometimes to say truth, it doesn't mean that you have to say everything what happened. Sometimes you have to find your own path to tell the story truly. You know, that's, you know, I was first AD of Krzysztof Kieślowski in Decalogue, you know, and it was very interesting because as first AD I was watching him, and he was working with actors, and the same sentence, short sentence, he asked them to repeat and repeat, and he said, "You are lying, it's not true."
Don't believe.
I said, what's the difference? 10 times, you know, it's not true. What does that mean?
We are lied over time.
Absolutely. But when I became director, working with actor, I immediately have heard, well, what does that mean, not true? You know, because you feel it, you know, if you work hard. And I believe, of course, responsibility is on writer's side, first of all. But still, you have to ask yourself, what kind of a margin of a freedom I have? You know, for example, you know, now we are developing a story which is also based, it's a drama series, based on a true story of attempt of killing the Black Commando last terrorist, which happened in communistic Poland. It was like out of heaven, you know. Somebody was trying to shoot somebody in the hotel in '81. And slowly it was revealed that that was the brain of Black September Commando who made attack in Munich at Olympic Games. You know, and nobody knows really about the story. Mm-hmm. There are certain elements which we know, Abu Dawood. We took that, but then we saw that there is lack of any information, and then this is our space. You know, because going, you know, traditional way, nowadays we would have only men spies, men killer, men all the witnesses, you know. So he said, no, we disagree. Let's find the way to put females into the story, and we succeeded. So being, you know, like completely turning around, but the essence is there, I'm sure. We don't false the history.
And
Can I
after
add?
you, Rita. Yeah.
So I would add that it's like as we are storytellers, right? We have to be honest storytellers. It's like when we use events, details to enrich our characters, right? Because until the audience is following the character, they're watching the movie, right?
Absolutely.
So it's all about characters. Until the characters can get this emotional response from the viewers. That's it.
Yeah, I should say, if anybody has questions, please do put your hand up, and we can include them as well. Michael, I want to talk to you about your project, the supermarket disaster 30 years ago, because that's an interesting one where you're merging a factual event that is very well known in Greece, is going to cut through, which I guess, true stories, that is one of the elements that really helps. But then you move the story on very much, and it's fictional almost. How do you, what was the thinking behind that project?
Look, I think in everything we do, there are two drivers here, as producers at least. One is the marketing driver, the commercial driver, and the other one is more of the moral driver, where we have a responsibility to tell some story. We feel we have the responsibility to tell some stories worth told. So talking about based on true events, or talking about based on a best-selling novel, or talking about nominated for 6 awards or whatever, that takes it's a big shortcut. It's a big shortcut for decision making for the audience. If it's based on a true event, if it's been nominated, if it's based on a book, it's worth me clicking on it. Yeah, it's than something that I know nothing about. So on that side, we always think there is this kind of bigger marketing value to tell a true story than maybe a story that nobody has ever heard of. So that's on that side. So basing a story on a true event like the destruction of an epic shopping mall in Athens, people say, oh yeah, I know about this. I would like to hear more about this. I'll watch it. On the other side, though, the more moral aspect of what we do, there are some stories that we believe as storytellers that are worth talking about. I'll give you another example. I'm co-producing a docu-series with broadcasters and producers in Italy, Austria, and Germany called The Other 300. This is the story of a mass grave that was discovered 100 years ago outside the city of Thebes in Greece, with 300 ancient Greek soldiers buried by holding hands. So as in 150 couples holding hands. They were slaughtered by Alexander the Great army, and they were buried like this out of respect because they were male lovers. And that's what was considered to make this sacred band of soldiers more powerful than others because they were fighting for each other. So this is a beautiful story that's at the moment that story landed on our desk, we're like, we need to tell the story of the other 300 because we all know the original 300. And now that story hasn't been told for 100 years because it was considered immoral, it was considered something that would go against people's perception of ancient Greece maybe. So you also have a moral responsibility when you find a true story to tell it. So whether it is a shopping mall that burns down or whether it is an army of lovers, you kind of need to tell the story because whether it is a marketing tool or not is a story worth telling. So I try to navigate across those two aspects of life.
Yeah. Let's talk about morals. Yeah, we've only got 15 minutes left. We'll rattle through this. We're running out of time quickly. So I'll keep my question short. Frank, morals is a good, and lines in terms of when you're writing, if you're writing a show and one of the victims or one of the people involved in that, they say they do not want to be involved, they don't want you to go ahead with this, etc., etc. Who has ownership of these true stories that we want to tell? Especially some of as we've been talking about, some of the darker stories are also the most popular. So we have this sort of juxtaposition of two conflicting forces to some extent.
Yeah, I think there are some broadcasters, certainly in the UK, who will not go forward if the victim in the crime is not agreeing to have the story told. And I understand that point of view, but I also think these stories exist in the public eye. There are books that are written about them, there are documentaries, they are being talked about. And so my personal opinion is that if you're a victim, I am very sympathetic and sensitive and will be very careful about the way and respectful about the way your story is told, but I don't think it gives you the veto right over whether that story is told. And if there was a true story that I really wanted to tell, it's going to be because I think there's a really powerful idea that that story conveys. And so, yeah, my feeling is that victims don't have veto power over the stories that are told about them. But having said that, you know, recently there have been some dramas that have been made where victims have complained that they were treated irresponsibly. And I have sympathy for those people, you know, and I think that that's wrong, that they should be treated accurately and sensitively.
Yeah, Rita, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, just unless it's when it becomes not a private story anymore, it's like go to public. So probably it's dubious, not like you have to negotiate with this victim, but still you can use this public information, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, Larry, you've got, a project, we touched on it earlier, the sort of the ways that you go about, I'm sure we've got lots of producers in the room, who might have stories that they want to pursue. Have you had experience where victims might not want the story told, but you still have to sort of go ahead and how do you approach that situation? Because it's obviously, you've got a business to run, you've got, at the end of the day, where does the line lie and how do you navigate that situation?
Just like your shopping centre story, there's a drama we tried to get going based on a fire in Dublin where 48 mainly teenagers died in a nightclub. I remember the date as vividly. It was the 13th of February, the night before Valentine's Day in 1980. And it was ferocious, it was horrible. And I set about trying to tell that story years later when I moved into television and got a copy of the public inquiry, went to meet with some of the victims' families and some of the survivors who were there. What got me thinking about it was I actually had an accident. I burnt my arm in an accident. I was in a burns unit. And one of the guys in the burns unit had been in the fire. I'm in the hospital 8 years later. He's still getting surgery for the fire, and I heard some of the stories about it. And, I got sucked into trying to do too much, trying to be too accurate to that story, to nearly become part of we can get justice for these people.
Yeah.
No, we can't. We're just storytellers. And we never made that show. Another show was made. It didn't have as much detail. It didn't go into the lives of all the families. I didn't think it was a particularly brilliant drama, but it got made. So I think there's a fine line. I think you need to be cognizant and aware, but I think you have to decide what your story is and go for it.
Mm. And Darius, let's talk to you about, we've only got about 9 minutes left. So there's, as we've been talking about, the premise of this whole session is the interest in true stories. Everyone's after cut-through content. Everybody wants a thumbnail that you're going to click on, a little bit of synopsis that's going to really cut through, whether it's a mall fire in Greece or a well-known event in Ireland. Is there a danger, do you think, with true stories now, and I guess we're talking about true crime and disasters and unpleasant events more than flying across the Atlantic in a plane? Is there a danger that we're kind of pushing the boundary a bit too far? Are the streamers perhaps becoming too brave? Are there lines being crossed, do you think?
There's one thing which always counts, and Rita mentioned that, the truth of characters, because circumstances, this is disputable. You can find, more freedom or less freedom. But one thing, even if you are making fantasy, you have always constantly, you have to check the credibility of your characters. Mm-hmm. Because if you lose this credibility, you lose the audience immediately. This is very important, because if people, of course, you cannot build characters as everybody wants or expects. But even if you want to surprise somebody, it has to be credible, So if you build Hannibal Lecter, still you have to acknowledge that people can work like this. And that's why I really love, stories also based on documentaries as First Gate or books, but also consultation of psychologists. Very often, after the script is developed, I'm asking experts from psychological point of view or psychiatrists sometimes. Do you believe in it? Why he did it? I don't get it. Why he did it? And I get expertise, that sometimes people are doing it, and then I say, okay, this is fine. This is credible.
Yeah.
This is confirmed,
Even in a complete, fictitious drama series, we just completed a crime series, but we brought in real cops to check the scripts, to check the investigation details. So you want that story to be real,
Yeah.
but it's not.
And what's your view on sort of the lines being pushed? We had a few cases in the States, excuse me, on streamers, where there was a bit of pushback, and I think Frank, you were talking about it earlier. Do you think we're getting to a point where the entertainment value of true stories is perhaps overtaking what we're actually, the authenticity to some extent? Larry, for you?
I think in today's world, unfortunately, the truth has become a victim in a lot of cases, and we have to guard against a world that the real truth is disappearing. I think for Rita to actually be here, to physically get here, to be here, is a completely different experience to everyone in this room. And what the people in Ukraine are going through every single day today. Somebody who would take that story or elements of that story and not tell what's going on as truth, well, then that's a very dangerous world. So I think there's a real requirement for us as storytellers to never lose the fact that we have to entertain, but don't lose the reality.
Yeah. And Frank, you started off, a nice little, discussion about the X-Files, obviously being, based on real life. Do you think, that extreme example, we fast forward today, and there's so many shows we could watch that are based on real life, but we're not always quite sure how closely they're based on real life. Is there a danger, do you think, that true stories and the allure that brought us to true stories in the first place is, the fact that they're kind of true? Is there a danger that the truthful elements are being sort of pushed aside in favour of entertainment?
Yeah, I think some of these are done really, really well, and some of them are done less well. But I think, it's like Michael said, when you hear something's based on a true story, you just instinctively go, oh, and you want to know more. And I think, for me, one of the great appeals of true stories is they're always surprising. It's not... So often, storytellers kind of recycle things they've seen in other movies and TV shows, and true stories are true, and they happened in a way that nobody expected. And because it's true, things that you might reject in a fictitious story, you go, yeah, but that is what happened, right? And there's a delight. And I also think, not to get too philosophical about it, but the reason we like stories is because we get to see the world through other people's eyes, and you learn something about what it is to be alive and what it is to exist in a society. And true stories have a special power because they're real, right? This really did happen. But our gift and curse as storytellers is you can't just make a documentary. It's impossible. You need to shape it into a narrative form. There's going to be characters that have to be combined or eliminated. It has to be simplified. Timelines have to be compressed. But the really good storytellers do that in a way that heightens your understanding, deepens your understanding. And the less gifted ones do it in a way that hurts the victims, confuses the audience, and both are being made right now.
Good stuff. If you do have a question, please put your hand up, because we've only got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to run down, if we can. Darius, we'll start with yourself. Let's give everyone a takeaway from this session. If they're looking to do true stories, which I'm assuming you're all trying to do because you're in this panel, what would be your piece of advice to them? What would be the the best piece of advice you could give them in terms of how to best chase down that true story and get it made ultimately, because that's why we're all here, let's be honest.
You know, I would like to say quite provocatively that not everything what happened is truth sometimes. So still, you have to transform it. You have to transform it because, you know, everything is transformation. If you tell the real story and then you cast with an actor, you manipulate the story. So on the other hand, you can't be just tied because of the true story as a creator. You have to be smart and wise how to tell the story to be true. Mm-hmm. And this is important, what counts at the end. That's my opinion.
Good stuff. Rita, what about yourself?
Yeah, like we have to carry our responsibility in front of the viewers, and sometimes it's impossible, just like, because it's really like a weight, like you have to compromise between truth and between the quality of your show. So it's the question how far you can compromise, how far you are ready to compromise. But again, my approach is about characters, all events, which helps the character to develop its arc. So it's just gain quality to it, production value to it.
Great. Larry, it's getting tougher as we go along.
I think, look,
Sorry for Frank.
a takeout. When I was asked about going on the panel, I hadn't actually thought about, you know, true stories and put it into one of our key metrics that we would look on, you know, the value of a project or the, you know, whether we green light or whatever. It's an interesting one to put into that mix, though. You know, where is the truth? What's the upside here, and where does the truth sit in what we're about to do, and actually give it a more important place? I mean, previously it would have been, how good is the script? Who's the writer? What have they done? You know, so there is maybe putting in that truth as part of it, and rising it up in terms of its rationale factor.
Good stuff.
Okay, so we have 16 seconds divided by 2 at 8 seconds. Don't look.
We all blow up. Yeah.
Don't look only for the big true stories, Chernobyl, Titanic, Apollo 13. Blah, blah, blah. Look also for the smaller true stories that happen next to you. The Watcher on Netflix is a very good example of that.
Some very sound advice.
0 seconds.
And Frank, you're all out of time, but we're still going to get you to do it. So
a lot of wisdom on this panel. I think for me, it's just, I always ask myself, well, why am I telling this story? Why? Why does the story need to be told? What is it you have to say about this? And I think there are some true stories that I see where it just feels like it's a prurient interest. There's really no insight or reason to the story other than just sort of people are interested in morbid subject matter or something like that. But if it's like, no, there's a really interesting question that this story asks that is worth thinking about. It can be entertaining, but it can also be enriching for the audience and leave you thinking about the show long after you finished watching it. And that's always my goal with all television, whether it's true story or fiction, is to do something that the audience remembers and is glad they watched, you know, for months and years to come.
Good stuff. Well, yeah, we are well and truly out of time. Darius, Rita, Larry, Michael, Frank, thank you very much for giving so much of your time and insights. We've got a bit philosophical there, but we got through loads of information. Hopefully you've got some interesting takeaways as well. We'll wrap it there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.